How does the theology of the body, I mean, I have an idea of what that whole thing is, but I've never studied it, right? I mean, I think everybody recognizes the term.
Yeah.
We know that John Paul II gave these addresses on Wednesdays, and I guess all of that became his theology of the body textbook, sort of, something like that. I was close, right? Close enough.
Close.
All right. Something like that. What is it in that that's separate from just like teachings in the catechism or something, that what's unique to that body of work that he did that would address something like this transgenderism? I mean, like what is it that, how does being a theology of the body expert help you deal with this, other than just like, no offense, but like common sense,
None taken.
Right.
I mean, good theology builds upon good common
Yes.
sense, right?
Yes.
So those are not opposed to one another. So the theology of the body, I mean, let's couple of general thoughts here, I guess. John Paul points out in those catecheses that he gave over the first 5 years or so of his pontificate that with the incarnation, the body enters theology by the front door, because the Son of God assumed a human body, right? The Son of God took on a male body. So the body is part of how God has communicated himself to us in the second person of the Blessed Trinity. So we have to take the body seriously. And he gives us this catechesis, and what he's doing is basically, it is a biblical understanding of the human person. And he looks at the human person from the vantage of creation, the fall, and redemption. And he points out that in creation, right, everything God does, everything God makes is a gift, right? If we want to understand ourselves, we have to understand ourselves, our existence. God doesn't owe us existence, back to essence and existence, right? Our existence is a gift. And God creates us, and he creates us as rational beings, capable of knowing him, of choosing him, of loving him. And yet, as wonderful as that is, the text of God says in Genesis 2:18, it's not good for the man to be alone. In other words, we can't fulfill God's purpose for us as solitary beings. It's only when God casts this deep covenant sleep on the man, takes out one of his ribs, builds it into a woman, the man responds by saying, this one is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. This one will be called woman, because out of man she's been taken. The interesting thing here is, in the Hebrew text, up to this point, he's only been called Adam, human, or the man in the generic sense. But now we have the gender-specific terms: man, ish; woman, isha. This one shall be called Isha, because out of ish she's been taken. So we discover the meaning of our own body only in light of the other sex. I discover what it is to be man in light of woman. Woman discovers what it is to be woman in light of man. John Paul calls that the spousal meaning of the body. So our bodies, as sexually differentiated, reveal that we're ordered to one another and to God in a relationship of gift, right? We are, the thing that fulfills us ultimately is the ability to make a gift of ourselves in love. And as human beings, we always and only do that through our bodies, right? And that's true in marriage. It's true in religious life or priesthood. You make a gift of yourself, the whole of your life, through your body, right? And to give the body is to give the person. So we're not think minds trapped in bodies, like some kind of Cartesian, thinking machines, right? We are embodied persons. So if I'm going to know and to love as a human being, I come to know the world around me and others around me through my body. And I give myself in love to family, to friends, to my spouse, to God through my body. So the body expresses the person. So whereas gender ideology tries to drive this wedge between the body and a self-chosen gender, the theology of the body says, no, we are integral subjects, and our sexually differentiated bodies are integral to who we are as persons. And we can only think and act and love with our bodies.
Do you know if John Paul II spoke or wrote at all about transgenderism specifically?
He did. As a professional philosopher in Love and Responsibility, Karol Wojtyła.
That's going back a ways.
It was written in Polish in 1960. But he talked about, to use a term we talked about a little bit earlier over lunch, hermaphroditism.
Okay.
Right, by which he meant intersex conditions, right? There are people whose bodily expression of sex difference is ambiguous in some way, but he insisted, and in fact, there's also a text in the Theology of the Body Catechesis where he talks about there's a certain way in which being a body is prior to being sexed or being aware. In other words, I can only, as a human being, I can only be an embodied person. I'm not an angel, right? I'm not a spiritual person. So there's a givenness to our body, and both men and women are embodied beings. But then there's the further later discovery of sex, especially in going out from myself and giving myself in relationship to others. A further insight that the Theology of the Body gives us, related to your last question as well, is he writes at one point, man becomes the image of God by entering into communion. In other words, by giving oneself in love to enter into marriage, to enter into a religious life, we reflect God, who is an eternal communion of persons, an eternal communion of love of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So we don't just image God in the powers of our soul, our intellect, memory, and will, which is kind of the classical psychological analogy for the image of God. We also image God by going out from ourselves in love, by making a gift of ourselves in love as embodied persons.
But God doesn't have a body. I mean, the second person of the Trinity does.
That's right.
So help me with that. I mean, like, how, when we talk about the image and likeness of God, how does the body fit in that? Because God doesn't have a body.
Sure. And God, even though we will call God Father and Son, right? As John Paul writes in his document Mulieris Dignitatem on the dignity and vocation of women, doesn't mean God has biological sex. God is a spiritual reality that transcends biological sexuality. So what we need to recall here is the teaching of the Fourth Lateran Council, right? The doctrine of analogy. Whenever I use the same word to describe God and human beings, there is both similarity but even greater dissimilarity. So God is a communion of persons in a far more real and total way than any loving human marriage or human community or religious community could ever be. But there is a real analogical connection. I'm not using these words in a completely dissimilar way. So no, God does not have a body, but God is an eternal communion of persons in love. And we are persons as well. We're different from God. We are embodied persons, right? Although the Son of God assumes a human nature with a human body in the incarnation and now possesses that glorified human body in heaven, which is the cause of our being able to participate in the sacraments and receive sacramental grace. It's Christ's crucified and glorified human body. Thomas teaches that's the instrumental cause of all the efficacy of the sacraments.